Hello, everybody. This is Craig from the Pacific War Channel, where we cover the entire history of the Asia-Pacific War from 1937 all the way up to 1945 and all the major events led up to it. Today, we are certainly not talking about the Pacific War. It's going to be something quite different. So, again, my co-host is here. Gaurav, how are you?
Hey, Greg, wonderful to be here and really looking forward to this very interesting battle that we're going to be discussing.
Yeah, so as the title will suggest, this is going to be on the Battle of Leipzig, and it's one of the most important battles in human history. For those who aren't as familiar with the Napoleonic War era, it's, I guess, only second to Waterloo if someone had to, pitch them against each other. But I think Leipzig actually is a bit more grand in some ways. But before we jump into it, just want to say to everybody, I have a brand new YouTube membership. It's completely a replica of my Patreon account, so it's the same perks, the same amount of money and everything. So join whichever you would like if you'd like to get some bonus content. But what you can expect if you join that, at a minimum, you're going to get access to the exclusive podcast. And I think I have more than about 25 podcasts at this point. You get about one each month. You get access to all the content I make quite early. I'd say almost a month in advance, usually, typically, let's say. And of course, you get voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. And as a little bit of a bonus, actually, if you do join the YouTube membership over the Patreon, there are some unlisted episodes over there that never saw the light of day. And, for good reason. Maybe they'll be of interest to you. But stating all of that, I guess the only way to jump into this rather extensive podcast is probably going to be a long one. Is I guess Gareth, you can give us a little introduction as to why is there a Battle of Leipzig in the first place?
All right, so I'm probably going to go back in time a little bit. So after the French Revolution, you had the War of the First Coalition where Europe kind of ganged up on France to stamp out the revolution. It was during that tumultuous period Napoleon starts rising to power or fame. I think fame is the right term at that time. And by 1796, he is promoted to General of Division, commands the army of Italy, and helps win the war for France. And despite several like his failed expedition to Egypt, he returns and through political maneuvering with some political allies, including his brother and some of the directors of France, he is made first consul of France, thereby effectively taking full power over France. And 1804, the man crowns himself as emperor, which honestly, I really like that concept of crowning himself emperor. I mean, that's pretty cool. And yeah, and then we pretty much have just seen war in Europe since 1792, and it'll just dominate his reign. So you have the War of the Third Coalition, where he wins his one of his most famous victories against Russia and Austria at Austerlitz and dictate terms. Then Prussia joins in the war, and he crushes Prussia at Jena-Austadt, and in 2 months just practically destroys the Prussian army. And in middle of 1807, he crushes the Russian army at Friedland, which brings Russia as an ally to France. Now, right now, he's pretty much in control of Europe, but he starts to overexert himself and overstretch. Because unfortunately for him, Britain still remained a threat, and her navy was squeezing the life out of the French and European economies. So he tried to kind of put his own embargo on Britain, and Britain resorted to funding his enemies. And when he decides to invade Spain, uh, he's also starting to sacrifice resources there because now that Portugal's involved, Britain and Portugal are great friends. And again, the one thing that should be noted, even though Russia, and Austria are kind of they've been subdued, they are not going to let that stand. Austria declares war in 1809, and that's where you actually see an interesting development. The French army of Napoleon until this time had the best organization and training. Now, the Austrians were mimicking that. Did not have the time to get as proficient because it was just some reforms that had just been implemented by a couple of months or so. But the results were there for everyone to see. And meanwhile, the continental system of Napoleon has really ruined Russia's economy. So they start an illicit trade with Britain. He's quite pissed off. He annexes the Duchy of Oldenburg in Germany, which was like, belonging to one of the Romanov family members. So that also pissed them off. And we have in 1812 his very famous invasion of Russia, where he amasses a gargantuan force of 600,000 men. Keep in mind, this is not even counting the couple of 100,000 men probably in Spain right now.
You should mention to the audience, it was Napoleon who brought in something that come we it's not necessarily total war, but it's basically getting onto that level where, before Napoleon, you didn't see these massive conscripted armies of like just regular common people being armed en masse, like this. So this
Especially
kind of army
for
is insane.
prolonged,
Yeah.
yeah, for prolonged periods of time. And yeah, so we have the invasion of Russia, and that was huge. Even though, granted, a lot of the men were not even French, they were like corps from Prussia, Austria, Germany, Italy, who were all French allies at this time. And he unfortunately overestimates his abilities there, or underestimates the Russians. They employ scorched earth tactics, which was like advocated by Generals Barclay de Tolly and Field Marshal Kutuzov, who realized that was the best way to win. And they utilized the Cossacks to destroy his supply lines. And the winter hit. The Russians were not breaking because when you invade someone's home, they fight even harder. And yeah, then it leads to the very infamous retreat. Granted, more people died in the summer advances to Moscow than they did in the winter. But yeah, by the time towards the middle of December, when the French retreat, he is pretty much left with about 20, 30,000 troops of that initial invasion force. That's a huge loss. And Prussia and Austria now sense blood. Russia's already on the war path. And Sweden has now also joined in. And curiously, Sweden is right now ruled by his former marshal and also a family member, um, Jean Baptiste Bernadotte. So it's been an interesting turn, even though the man always said he will pursue Swedish interest overall. So you have 1813, the French forces are retreating. Napoleon's returned to France to organize a new army. And now we are set for a stage where the main theater of operations is going to be Germany, right? So now we're talking about early Germany. Now, keep in mind, Russia has also taken a brutal beating in the invasion. Let's not forget that. Like the French also took a beating, but they took an equal beating, if not more. So they're advancing slowly, and at this time, Austria declares neutrality, and they kind of negotiate separately because the Austrians were kind of watching the southern flank of Napoleon's salient in Russia, and for now they're not going to be involved in any capacity. And however, Prussia joins the war in full capacity by March. So, and one thing to note is the new Prussian army that is coming in is a well-trained, well-disciplined force. It's not having the old traditions of officers only being from the aristocracy. You had the men from all classes were able to advance. They removed all the unnecessary punishments. They, uh, they put mandatory training so that, and they did not keep like a standing army. They kept like a rotating pool of men so that you have a larger pool to call upon. And that's why Prussia committed to fielding at that time about 80,000 men in what they call the Liberation War. And yeah, so you have the start of the spring campaigns where the Russians also suffer a big, I would call it a big loss, is when Field Marshal Kutuzov is wounded and then dies of his wounds. So General Wittgenstein is promoted to command the Allied forces. In the meantime, Napoleon was not idle. He spent the last couple of months calling up the draft classes of 1813 and 1814 to create a pretty sizable army at the moment. Uh, all things considered. So while the Russians are definitely advancing with the Prussians, because the current French forces are quite exhausted, you do have 200,000 men mobilized under Napoleon in the spring of 1830. Now, that's an incredible feat, considering the losses he's taken. Granted, they were not the same quality of soldiers of the old Grande Armée, but you have about 80,000 to 100,000 Prussian and Russian soldiers against 200,000. And you do have some key encounters at the start, where you have the Battle of Lutzen, and then you had the Battle of Bautzen. And in both, Napoleon did technically score victories over them by forcing the Allied armies to retreat. But unfortunately for him, he's taking way more losses than he can sustain. For example, at the Battle of Lutzen, he lost almost 25,000 men, while the Allies lost 20,000. Granted, one of the big losses at the Battle of Lutzen was General Mont, host of the Prussians, who was the big reformer of their army. And then you have the Battle of Bautzen, where he again tries an envelopment. And this was actually a pretty interesting position for this battle. It was near the border with Austria at the moment. Keep in mind, Austria has not joined the war on either side, but they are watching from their territory with an army of around 250,000 men.
Yeah, both sides commanders would be aware that Austria will engage whoever they think is gradually winning the war. So both are eyeing it. Yeah.
True. And the Allies also kind of wanted to tempt Napoleon because he did want to try to trap and encircle the armies to violate Austrian territory, which obviously then Austria will not stand for, and then they will easily declare for the Allied forces. And he doesn't, but unfortunately for him, his orders to his marshal, especially Marshal Ney, was quite vaguely worded, and he kind of also overestimates the ability on how quickly these new recruits can march. It takes time to get these men into a shape where they can take forced marches day in and day out. And yeah, so the Battle of Bautzen, which was in May, he again takes twice the number of casualties, but lets the enemy retreat in good order. And at the same time, there is a bit of a blow is when Sweden has now entered the war and they capture the city of Hamburg, which is a big port. So they did, the French then had to divert a sizable force of almost 40,000 men to take back the city, which Sweden did vacate towards the end of May. And now both sides decided to call a truce, which is kind of more or less brokered by Austria. And it's suited for both of them because they both wanted to reinforce their armies. Because Prussia was still mobilizing, and a lot of the Russian reserves were still moving from, the Russian hinterland into Germany. And both sides did want to get Austria involved. So what you have is now Clemens von Metternich, the foreign minister of Austria, plays a bit of a role here now. So he wants to restore Austria's prestige. However, he also wants to limit Napoleon, but not completely destroy him. And he said, you go back to pre-revolutionary France borders, you dissolve the Confederation of the Rhine, you give us the Illyrian provinces, that is like, the Balkan coast, and we have the repartition of Poland between, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. You still remain emperor. Uh, Napoleon refused to accept any of those terms, which pretty much confirmed that Austria will be joining the coalition. And it did kind of go against Metternich's aim because he knew that Russia is now the rising power, so he cannot fully see France destroyed, or else who's there to really oppose Russia?
I'll just
So,
kind of explain something to the audience. The audience might not understand this term, but we're talking basically about the balance of power, which historically in
mhm.
Europe, it's all of the great monarchs or emperors in this case, they were performing these kind of gentleman-like wars. Although the Napoleonic era is completely different. Napoleon did want to conquer, but there was this kind of underlying concept that you would band together against who's the largest power because no one should have a monopoly. And historically, most of, continental Europe followed this plan, except for Britain. Britain just didn't care. Britain did whatever they wanted to do. But, until Napoleon,
Well,
this was kind
Britain
of the
was,
understanding. Yeah.
well, to be fair, Britain, they realized that they don't need to be in this continental power
They're the
struggle
special
because
case,
they're the
yeah.
Navy.
Yeah,
They're the
yeah, they're a
Navy.
special case. In the British Empire, it's like they were allowed to be all around the world because they didn't see it as conquest. They saw it as, mercantilism. Anyways, just wanted to state that, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think I should have really explained that. There's just so much to really talk about for this campaign, and I'm not really even doing it justice.
No, no, this is
Not
like
being honest.
basically this is like saying, hey, today's subject is going to be the Battle of Verdun, but you have to explain like what's going on in World War One. Like that's kind of
True enough.
equivalent, yeah.
Yeah. So now you have four massive coalition armies that have been mobilized. So, and the coalition has been formed. So right now the coalition partners are Britain, Sweden, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Spain, and Portugal. So and for this war, Spain and Portugal kind of the theater does have some significance, but not a massive one. But it did have one big consequence. So in June 1813, Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, the founder of my college, so yeah, I'm from King's College London, so quite proud of that. He defeats Napoleon's brother and Marshal Jourdan at the Battle of Vittoria, which pretty much has freed up Portugal and most of Spain from Bonapartist control. So, as French forces there are in full retreat, Napoleon has to send Marshal Soult, one of his most able commanders, to kind of stabilize that front. And this is also going to expose an entire flank of advance for the Allied coalition. But Germany is still going to be the main theater, and that's where Napoleon will be concentrating most of his remaining good commanders and forces. Because keep in mind, he's lost some of them, especially like close friends. So you had in just the German campaign, Marshal Bessier, who tended to command the Imperial Guard cavalry, was killed while conducting reconnaissance. And in another battle, General Duroc, a very close friend of his. So he's losing a lot of close supporters just in this campaign. So at the moment, at the start of the campaign in like what they call the autumn, once the treaty ended, the Napoleon himself had an army of over 350 to 400,000 men mobilized. Right, this is including his main force and whatever garrisons he's having in the region. But the Allies have split into four armies. So you have the most massive, the Army of Bohemia, which is almost a quarter of a million men under the Prince of Schwarzenberg, who's considered one of the best commanders of the time. Then you have the Army of the North under Bernadotte, now the King of Sweden, well, Crown Prince at the moment. And then you also have the Russian Reserve Army, which is going to be reconstituted as the Army of Poland under General Bennigsen. And then you have the Army of Silesia under General Blucher. And more importantly, they now adapt the Trachenberg Plan, which had been primarily drafted by Marshal, Bernadotte. And this was basically a attritional warfare plan that had been developed. So these guys, they recognize that, you know, he is a very capable commander, Napoleon, but his marshals may not be. So the idea is that over time, they will whittle him down. They will not engage him directly if they come up the forces under Napoleon's command, but they will, engage his marshals. That will start to deteriorate his forces. And then once he's sufficiently weakened, they will move in for the kill. That was pretty much the essence of the Trachenberg plan. And it was seen pretty early in the autumn campaign where Napoleon did advance into Polish territory, and General Blucher, who you definitely could call as one of the most aggressive commanders of the time. I mean, his soldiers really nicknamed him Marshal Forward. So he actually withdrew, and then Napoleon would leave a garrison there, and so that just shows where the battle would be won or lost, and the coalition learned it the hard way as well, because the city of Dresden, right, in the Kingdom of Saxony, uh, the Russian army and Austrian army did advance, and you're talking about an army of almost 220,000 between them, and you have Marshal Saint-Cyr, who Napoleon did rate as the best defensive commander in the world at that time. He was holding the city. He works with Napoleon, and in the two-day battle, the Allies only realized the hard way why they need to follow the Trachenberg plan, because when Napoleon came, they won the battle. And he took 10,000 casualties in that fight, but inflicted 4 times as much on the the coalition. This was his last great victory. And so, that's where you have it. But despite this, they kind of also are losing. The Trachenberg plan is seeing its fruit born elsewhere. So you have the Battle of Kulm, where General Van Damme is, he is kind of taken aback by, he's isolated and then forced to surrender a large part of his corps. That's 25,000 Frenchmen, gone. Just this one battle. And there's also had the Battle of Gros Baron, where but Marshal, so the Crown Prince Karl Johann the 15th, or Bernadotte, as I'll just call him, it's kind of easier for me to remember him that way. It's marching down. Napoleon left Marshal Oudinot to deal with him, thinking, yeah, I know Bernadotte, I know his capacity. He's not a great general. Well, Bernadotte takes about 1,500 casualties on a force of 32,000 men. Oudinot's force takes almost 4,000 casualties on a size of 18,000 men. Apparently, he doesn't know the true capacity of his former marshal. And yeah, and then you have the Battle of Katzbach, which was a campaign of General Blucher versus Marshal MacDonald, where they were fighting at the Katzbach River, and MacDonald was forced to retreat, and he suffered more casualties than the Allies. So keep in mind, Napoleon does not have as many men, and yet he's taking more casualties. So this is really not good.
And on
So
top of that, he has a quantity versus quality problem because the quality of his older veteran troops, the loss of them it's catastrophic for him at this point. He has a lot of less trained men to fill up the numbers.
yeah, and they take time. I mean, they're being trained in the same way, but you don't get veterancy easily. Granted, I would say I think he has overall a better, compared to the coalition, a better command corps, and he is a military genius in his own right. But unfortunately, that's not going to be the case. By now the Trachtenberg plan is going to be in full fruition,
Well, I
and
mean,
you have the
yeah.
armies.
The Trachtenberg plan is for those who know their ancient history more so. This is basically the Fabian strategy against like Hannibal. Like it's actually very similar, the situation.
It
It's yeah.
is. It is. It's just whittling him down. And, while you also, I should add one thing, while you have, Sweden, Russia, the northern German states, Prussia, Austria, all fighting and deploying like, a lot of men, Britain is also playing a very big role here. Granted, the bulk of the British land forces at this time are on the Iberian Peninsula under the Duke of Wellington. They are supplying a lot of funds and equipment to the Allied forces. So some of their contributions, right, to these nations, 8 million pounds in cash, like 8 million back then. So it's quite a sum today. I'm not sure what would be the modern day equivalent. You know, over 200 cannons, 18 million rounds of ammo, 750 tons of food, hundreds of thousands of uniforms, boots to keep the Allied armies functioning. And this is how Britain really fought the war against Napoleon. They funded his enemies and sucked the life out of the French economy. And it worked. Their wooden wall, as they're called, the Royal Navy played its role. So, yeah, I think now we've reached a point where they realize that now it's time to move in for the kill. His forces have been whittled down. So Napoleon is mobilizing his forces around Leipzig, which is a huge supply depot right now for his armies, and he is, preparing for a general battle there. Now, interestingly, I would say there is quite a decision which I do not agree why he did not do it. When he realized that the armies are moving in, two of his best commanders who are kind of garrisoning important cities were never called for. So you have Marshal Davout, who holds Hamburg, which is right now under no threat whatsoever, with almost 45,000 men. Then you have Marshal Saint-Cyr in Dresden, who is being besieged by the army of Poland, which will redeploy to Leipzig. I really wonder why he never called on this, because not only are you calling back two very capable marshals in their own right, you are also going to reinforce yourself with 70,000 men. It could have worked. Maybe that's just me speculating, but it's quite surprising why you would not want to go on for all hands on deck. So yeah, now we have, but he does have one big advantage, I will say, in this battle over the coalition. It's more on the simple lines that he is the master on the French side. It's his will. There's no debate. Whereas on the Allied side, you will have the plans of the Prince of Schwarzenberg, who's commander in chief, needing to be approved by Emperor Alexander I, who's the supreme commander. So we've seen like historically that it sometimes can be quite disastrous. Like it was the same situation with Caesar and Pompey at Pharsalus, for example. So what the plan that ultimately ended up coming to fruition was the Austrians will mount attacks on from the south on the western side of the river Plysser. So one will be the furthermost left attack will try to attack the main retreat line of the French from the city of Leipzig, and the others will take some villages in between. But the terrain was quite bad in that area, and I should keep in mind that the Russians actually did not even want this deployment. They kind of wanted like in the south where the tents and most of the Russian soldiers were, because they felt that is where you could deploy your army the best. And so right now you just have the army of Bohemia that's kind of converged and is facing off against Napoleon. Granted, it alone matches the size of the entire French army. So you have that. And however, Napoleon does misjudge the situation. When he sees that the armies are mobilizing, he's already asked Marshal Murat to kind of start withdrawing. Initially, he was like about 40 miles south of Leipzig to start withdrawing in good order towards Leipzig to so that it'll be easier for Marshal Ney, who's commanding the northern half of the French line, to send in troops. Napoleon's plan was quite simple. He just wants to try to smash through and maybe get through the enemy monarchs and cause a panic. And honestly, I think given the situation, that's probably the only thing he could have realistically hoped for winning because he's already at the quality and quantity disadvantage. And also one more thing, supplies. But he does calculate that the other allied armies are still a minimum of 2 days march away. So he has time for Marshal Ney to give up most of his forces, send them down south, and he can get a advantage here and launch that decisive attack. So the battle actually does start early in the morning on the 16th of October, where you have, so keep in mind, while it's called the Battle of Leipzig, there are many small villages across the landscape which are going to be subject to brutal fighting by both sides. So you have like, the first day of the advance is, the general advance of General Wittgenstein's corps group. So the former commander of the Russian forces is to advance and capture some villages that are on the southern side of the battle zone, I'll call it. So this is like, the villages of Wachau and sorry, I'm just have to refer Wachau, Markkleeberg, Dölitz, Konowitz, and Liebertwolkwitz. It's kind of also which are also happens to be the front lines of Napoleon. And keep in mind, he's positioned slightly behind that on Gallows Hill so that he has an elevated position to uh, watch the attack unfold and react, which, okay, that's a very good strategy by a commander. And so you start the attack quite early in the morning. And in this advance, there's not much to really talk about here. In the sense, it was just brutal fighting between Marshal Victor's and Marshal Poniatowski's corps groups. And we're talking about literally a regiment holding off an entire corps. And, Wachau, the village of Wachau, for example, changes hands, I think, 5 times in the morning. And a lot of the time, it was not even musket fire that was being decisive, it was the bayonet charges. And we have that situation for, the Allies. And unfortunately for them, this is now a bad situation because the Austrians, sorry, realize that they are not positioned well because they're splitting of their forces on the western side of the Plaiza River. Those forces can't really do much, and a redeployment will cost them hours. But they do get one lucky break in the sense that General Goulay's corps manages to threaten the retreat road to Leipzig, which does force Marshal Ney, who's currently ordered a lot of the northern forces to redeploy to the south. He has to divert an entire corps away to protect the retreat line, because an army, that's always sound strategy to keep your lines of retreat open. But you do have at least two more corps of soldiers reinforcing Napoleon in the south, and then he gets quite a nasty message from Ney. General Blucher's army of Silesia has arrived, which has forced Marmont's corps to turn about to defend the village of Muckern in the north. And Blucher just, without care, just launches his infantry. He doesn't care that they're going to die. But his intention is, I need to get these men on me so that the southern forces are going to get a advantage because Napoleon will not be able to attack with as much. So he does realize, Napoleon, that this is now the moment of truth. He has a small numerical advantage, but not quite a big one because the Austrian and Russian reserves of the army of Bohemia are marching up, and you have the forces that were deployed on the wrong side of the river also being moved to the correct position. But unfortunately for them, they are in the wrong position, so they're not going to be of any use for a few hours. So we have this interesting this situation, and in that you have Napoleon launch a major attack on one moment, which had at least three corps marching down. So you had Marshal MacDonald, you had Marshal Victor's corps, and the Young Guard moving in. And at the same time, Marshal Murat gathered 10,000 horsemen to make a charge. And at the same time, they do nearly succeed. They crash through the Allied lines, which Emperor Tsar Alexander did say that if we deploy as per the Austrian plans, we would be too thinly stretched. So, but unfortunately, they were kind of saved by the really rough terrain, so the French could not maintain that momentum for long, even though some units did get very close to the camp where the monarchs were. Now, if they managed to get and nab those guys, it'd be quite interesting to wonder what would have happened to the Allied command.
Yeah, it's a big historical what if situation because that would significantly alter the battle. Yeah.
Oh, completely. And yeah, but unfortunately, their attack gets nowhere. And to top it off, they start seeing Cossacks have started to arrive, which means, and right now the Cossacks are attached to the army of Poland, which means that the army of Poland is also closing in. And by the time, while the French get bogged down by the bad terrain and hedgerows, you do have the situation where they've lost the momentum and the Austrian Reserve Corps and fresh guard units are committed to the battle by the Allied forces. And they pretty much charge with immense ferocity. And that pretty much pushes the French back to their starting positions. So it's quite a big reversal, I would say, for Napoleon, because this was pretty much his gambit because he did not have any other choice. And unfortunately for him, the village of Magdeburg, which was a scene of heavy fighting and casualties, is finally taken. And this pretty much brings an end to the first day of the battle. And here, Napoleon did come out, I would say, a bit better, 25,000 casualties, but inflicting almost 30,000 on the Allied forces. But unfortunately, if you take it in terms of their percentage of the army, he's taken a higher percentage of casualties. And, there are more reinforcements on their way while he's not getting anything. And so that brings an end to day one of the Battle of Leipzig. Now, day two, October 17th, is kind of, it's a very relatively of a lull of a day. The army of Bohemia isn't really doing much. And it is only General Blucher who's just ordering his Russian divisions to, just charge head on to the walls of Leipzig. Because keep in mind, he's taken the city of Macon, even though he's taken a big um, battering as well. But he just doesn't care. He just wants to attack. But that is pretty much the only really significant action on the day. But the most important events were the arrival of more soldiers. So General Rainier, he's a Swiss general fighting for Napoleon. He does arrive with 40,000 reinforcements in the form of his Saxon corps. But unfortunately for them, sorry, for Napoleon and the French, while they get reinforced by 14,000, almost 150,000 Allied soldiers join in that day. When you have the army of Bohemia under General Bennigsen, sorry, the army of Poland, my bad, under General Bennigsen arrive in force, and the army of the north under Bernadotte, they've also arrived. So you have, so if you just, I think I should just put one thing in mind. So if you have Leipzig, which is on the border of like a couple of streams or rivers, with its western end exit under threat from General Gulai, you have the Allied armies completely encircling Napoleon from the north, east, and south. And this is all what the Trachenberg plan was supposed to amount to. And that night, Napoleon, I think, comes to the realization that, okay, this is the battle's lost. And he does make one overture to Emperor Francis I, who is his father-in-law, because of his second marriage after divorcing Josephine. And he proposes an armistice and says that I'll give up a lot of forts in Germany, but I want to withdraw beyond some point. All the three monarchs, that is Emperor Francis of Austria, Emperor Alexander of Russia, and King Friedrich William of Prussia, they all, ignore it. They deny it. Because for the simple reason that they know that they have him, encircled. They don't really need to do it. They hold the cards now. So on the start of 18th of October, you have what is really I don't know, I love the name. The Battle of the Nations take place because you have French, Italian, detachments of Spanish, Portuguese, British, Russians, Prussians, Germans, Austrians, Swedes, Croats, all on this battlefield. And keep in mind, this is the biggest battle Europe has seen until the First World War. Because overall, by the forces committed by both sides, we are talking of armies that exceed, between the two of them, exceed 500,000 men. And I think like the Roman Empire at its peak maintained 600,000 soldiers, but that's across the entire empire. Not sure any other time in European history you had so many men mobilized on one battleground.
Yeah, mobilized in one area. No, of course not. Yeah.
So it truly was. So during the night of 17th October, Napoleon does retreat. He gives up a lot of the positions he held on the 16th of October because he realizes that he cannot hold the position anymore. And if his men need to, look at a smaller, they can hold a smaller defensive line, sorry. It'll just be easier. And this is while he's trying to prepare for the retreat, which I think he realizes is the only option that the guy has at the moment. And so the plan was for the coalitions to launch 6 simultaneous assaults. So you have 2 assaults from Blucher on the north. An assault by Blucher from the north. Bernadotte will kind of attack from the northeast. Then the Russian and Austrian armies will make 4 big assaults. So the southeastern will be handled by the army of Poland, and the army of Bohemia will be taking the southern assaults and southwestern assaults, which is going to threaten the French retreat. That was pretty much the plan. And so at the start of the day, a lot of these villages, such as Wachau, Markkleeberg, etc., right, which Liebertwort quits, which which saw heavy fighting that saw hundreds and thousands of men on both sides killed or wounded. They are practically occupied unopposed because the French have already moved away. And then the biggest fighting of the day starts at the village of Prospeita, which is a village on the southern half, much more closer to Leipzig. And you have General Barclay's core group of 60,000 men advancing towards this one village. That's it. One village, and you have 60,000 Russian and Austrian soldiers on the march. And it was a key position because at this point, this is a linchpin at where Napoleon's line is. So there was a lot of pressure also put on General Barclay. And even though some other staff officers opposed, when three monarchs say that, well, you got to capture this point, you don't really have a choice other than to obey the orders. And this is like a village that has now been turned into a fortress overnight by the French. They use a garden rose at the village aesthetics, I'll call them, similar to what we see in Normandy, for example, with the hedgerows. And this gave them quite a lot of cover for the infantry. And there was like the reserves were quite closer, so they could be reinforced easily. And this time it was actually the Prussians that were really leading. So keep in mind, a lot of the Army of Bohemia's command, it's a mixed army of Austrian, Prussian, and Russians. And then, they attempt to storm the village, and the Prussians are just smashed back. Those Jaeger battalions are just taking heavy casualties. And then you kind of have a huge artillery battle. And that the French are in a desperate situation where Napoleon is committing the Imperial Guard to the battle. So it is a duel between the Prussian and Russian artillery against the French Imperial Guard artillery. And gradually the Imperial Guard started to gain the upper hand. The cavalry also tried to charge and grab them back. And however, while the French tried to then charge back, the Russian cavalry were able to countercharge to ensure that the French cannot really make any advance. And yeah, so the Prussians have now withdrawn from the battle for now, and the Russians are taking a lead because of the appalling casualties that were taken. And it was more successful as they start to make inroads, but now the Imperial Guard infantry are joining the battle. And again, the Russians are moved back. And however, they do succeed in the simple fact that they are whittling down his forces. And the stubborn defense, while it's being successful, and Emperor Alexander is just ordering more and more soldiers to be thrown at the village of Prosthaida, the French are also running low on ammunition. I remember like a report on this day, Marshal Poniatowski said that, oh, we just have supplies for an hour of sustained combat. So that is like kind of what, Proshaida is kind of like, this big brawl, I'll call it. It's probably like a brawl is probably the right term for it. And then now on the north, General Blucher and Charles Bernadotte, now actually called Charles John, the Crown Prince of Sweden, they hold a conference and they start their attack. And, he does, the Army of the North was slow in its advance. So Bernadotte has been quite criticized by historians and contemporaries after the battle. But it was also due to the fact that he did get reports that Berlin was going to be attacked, so he wanted to cover it off, and then he decided to, not march as quickly as, say, General Blucher did. Then there is a village in the north called Paunsdorf, which, the Prussians start bombarding, and then they start even mass artilleries. And here you see the British manpower detachment. So you have Captain Bogue of the British Rocket Brigade. So he's using an early form of the Congreve rocket. They were quite inaccurate, but if they hit, oh God, it caused a lot of terror because it had a very powerful warhead. And then I think this is right now it's still like Blucher that's advancing. The Swedes are still preparing and forming up. And I think later on, it does turn into a big artillery duel around the village of Schonefeld, where like you have literally two huge batteries on either side battery each other, and I think between the two of them, we're talking about over 300 cannons, and this is just at around one section. And again, the now not only has the young guard been committed on this side of the line, the old guard of the French Imperial Guard are being committed. Now, these are Napoleon's best troops. These are the most, they are probably, I would go as far as to say they are the most elite unit on this battlefield. They have to be commanded into battle. And, they just keep, they drive the enemy away. But Marshal Ney just realizes that with the overwhelming firepower and everything, it's just untenable and withdraws the attack from Schonefeld. And this is where Marshal Marmont also does suffer quite a few injuries in that artillery duel because he did lose that to Bernadotte. And then at the same time, the Swedish Jaegers also did participate in an attack, which they did lose about 200 casualties, but captured almost 800 Frenchmen. And only 35 of the 200 casualties were dead. So it's quite a successful attack. And on the other side, there was the village of Lindenau, which is on the west. So this is where the French line of retreat could be threatened. And that's why you had General Bertrand there. And, General Bertrand did attack and break this Austrian force. So the lines of retreat were open, luckily, for Napoleon. He does suffer one big setback today, though. Renier's Saxon Corps, about 6,000 of these 14,000 men that came with him, they just defected during the battle. They ran towards the Prussian and Swedish armies under Bernadotte, and it was such a quick charge or movement, I should call it. Charge is probably the wrong term. That Napoleon and the other French officers thought it was they were attacking, but they just went to surrender and join the line.
And it was a matter of time to see units do this.
And it's quite clear that they only wanted to surrender to the Army of the North and not the other Allied armies. So the reason for this is in the 1809 campaigns of Napoleon in Germany again, Bernadotte, the Crown Prince of Sweden, that time as a marshal commanded the Saxon Corps. And he did treat them with a lot of respect and conduct and conducted himself well. He stood by his men. He did not let them suffer appalling casualties, and he literally got into a big spats on the battlefield with Napoleon over the treatment of the Saxons. Because a lot of the time Napoleon did kind of use them as meat shields, and he did not do it. So he would not stand for it. So the Saxons really remembered that, and they wanted to surrender only to him. And obviously that was welcomed, and Luckily for Napoleon, the guard cavalry is there to plug that hole in his line. But now I think even he's realized that it's over. He has to retreat. So on the night of the battle, day of the third day, with both sides taking about 30,000 casualties again, you have the French army withdraw within the walls of Leipzig. This is where I think there's a humongous failure from the planning of the French. There were materials to build multiple pontoon bridges across the rivers, yet only one bridge was built. And keep in mind, you have thousands of wounded men in the city right now. What's going to happen to them? You can't transport them quickly. The retreat gets underway at 4 a.m. in the morning. And, Napoleon himself does leave at around 10 a.m. So, and the area is guarded by two divisions of the Young Guard. So he is committing some pretty strong units to, defend this point. I think one of the main reasons he also wanted to withdraw was he just knew he no longer had the supplies to maintain the offensive anymore. Marshal Poniatowski, the Polish prince, and keep in mind the only non-Frenchman to be ever made a Marshal of France, was put in charge of the defense of Leipzig. And so even though across the Elster River, there's only one bridge, the retreat starts, and there's not really much thought and plans being put in. I think maybe that's either an oversight miss by everybody or Napoleon's confidence that he could turn a miracle out. And so the defense would mostly be by the non-French soldiers, so Poles and Germans. And by 8 or 9 a.m. or so, by 7 a.m., the Allies learned about that the French have started their retreat. And not wanting to go, by around 9 a.m., they launch a full-scale assault by all armies across the entire set of Leipzig's walls. And this is where the civilians were hiding for their lives. As when Russians stormed in, the French used the houses for street to street fighting, and both sides were taking heavy losses. And this is a fight throughout the entire city, as the French just don't have the manpower to hold the line. Now, this is where a big tragedy takes place. As there was no clear plan for the retreat, what units, when, etc. After Napoleon left, General Duvivier was tasked with blowing up the bridge in the evening to secure the retreat. For some reason, he delegates the task to a Colonel Mont. All right. And now keep in mind, the colonel and general know the plan, or at least they know that by the schedule, they are not supposed to light the bridge until the evening, which is already jam-packed with explosives underneath. The colonel gives it to a corporal, and at just 1 o'clock in the afternoon, while there are hundreds of French troops crossing, he lights the fuse. And big boom. That's all I'm gonna say.
It's a Hollywood moment. Yeah.
Yeah, and the French rear guard, which is still in fighting shape, has still not even begun to cross. And many men are just they start swimming for their lives. And this includes, and three of the people that are left on their side, on the side of in the Allied side of the river now, I'll call it, are three of the French marshals, Marshals Oudinot, MacDonald, and Poniatowski. The first two do manage to swim their way across, but unfortunately, Marshal Poniatowski, his horse slips while crossing the river and he drowns. And he did not have the strength to swim because he's already been wounded a couple of times. And he was only a marshal for, I think, 3 or 4 days. But yeah, so this was like a brutal defeat for, the French. So granted that the Allied forces took over 55 to 60,000 casualties, they could afford it, even though it was still a high butcher's bill. The French, on the other hand, they had 38,000 killed or wounded that evacuated, or like, at least they managed to, the wounded managed to evacuate, but that's 38K men, and about 36,000 were captured. And around 7,000 Saxons also did defect. So this, if I'm not mistaken, is more than a third of Napoleon's army. And the morale is going to be shaken by now. Like initially, the French were still willing to fight under Napoleon, but now even for the most hardened troops, it's kind of hard to see them having that will again. It's not easy. And this is an interesting stat I did find. The amount of artillery shells expended during this battle. I would just like you, Craig, to just take a guess. Considering these are, the old cannons and not like, say, the shells we see in the World Wars. But I just wanted you to take a guess, please.
Both sides put together?
Yeah, it's just the total artillery shells fired.
Ballpark
Yeah, just a ballpark.
under 100,000.
Would you like two more guesses?
Is it above or below?
Much above, much higher.
Really? Wow. Okay. For this era, 250,000.
No,
Wow. Oh my God. Okay. So this really is okay. It had under 450,000.
close enough. It says 400,000.
Jesus. For this era, that's absolutely insane. That's crazy.
Yeah, and with the amount of corpses that were laying, because it was said that corpses were quite visible even for a year post the battle. And even like Metternich, who comes a couple of days later into the city, he's just like horrified about just like, all the bodies that he just sees.
It reminds me there was a I forget what episode it is, but Dan Carlin. Oh yeah, Dan Carlin was trying to explain during his series on World War One, because a lot of people always ask the question, what is the origins of World War One? And some people argue it goes back to the Napoleonic Wars, because Napoleon showcased what war could be on a grand scale when it comes to munitions and just manpower. And it's this kind of, yeah, it's these instances where you actually see
Yeah,
what is modern war, basically.
yeah, yeah. And so, yeah, this does bring an end to the battle. And this effectively destroys the Confederation of the Rhine, Napoleon's German state, as I'll call it, with several of them now openly switching sides to the coalition. So you had Baden, Saxony, and Württemberg now join after the battle. Keep in mind, the Kingdom of Bavaria has already defected, and they are the largest kingdom, like member of this confederation. And Tsar Alexander urges an all-out assault into France. And so, 3 weeks after the battle, you do have the small engagement at the Battle of Hanau, where Napoleon does, stem the tide of the retreat for a little bit. But, he has to start organizing the defense of France itself. And we will see that the 1814 campaign of Napoleon, even though he's kind of fighting a very defensive war, It is considered one of his finest moments because he's moving with rapid precision, striking from where the enemy does not expect, which is the hallmark of the Napoleonic art of war. But it's the battle of this battle is the one that permanently broke his power for good. And I know, like, it's kind of sad that this battle is not as well known as, say, Waterloo, which is, I guess that's because, the British remember Waterloo as being the greatest battle.
Well, it's because the British wrote most of the great history books that Anglo, the people who speak
I know.
English the British, they kind of own the rights to history during the 19th century because they just took it upon themselves to write the greatest books. And the large
It's
population of the world that spoke English, like you're looking at populations in the Commonwealth, in the United States, those who speak English as a second language, it prospered more than, let's say, people who are German speaking or arguably even French at the time because there's a lot of French. But yeah.
I mean, from personal experience, I knew about the Battle of Waterloo as the first major engagement I ever read about of
Mhm.
the French and Napoleonic Wars. And
Yeah.
keep in mind, this was like I think when I was 6 years old,
Yeah,
I
yeah, of
read in some
course.
fact book. And after that, I know the Russian invasion. But the Battle of Leipzig, I did not know for quite a while. And then when you see the significance of this battle, how big it was, how many nations came together. It's sad it's not as well known.
Yeah, it's the straw that broke the camel's back.
And there's like what ifs I will just say, right? Like what if he just got his commanders, like as I mentioned at the start, Marshals Davout and Saint-Cyr to march in and help him
Mhm.
because there was no point. He had to defend here and they you get two very able commanders.
But
It,
the overall strategy of the war by that year, it was in the favor of the coalition because Britain was there. They had a very effective blockade, and every year that went by, the French were getting weaker.
completely. And because the British economy was also growing stronger because
Yeah.
they were also attacking and raiding French commerce, they are able to supply the coalition with even more resources.
Hmm.
I mean, the material support that they sent is not insignificant by any mark.
Yeah. Napoleon needed
And
a better out. Napoleon needed a significant other player to join his force, and he got pigeonholed because of the political maneuvering by the coalitionary forces. Yeah,
and it's also down to his, as a diplomat, he was, I would say,
terrible.
a failure.
Oh, he's terrible.
Failure.
And he's
Yeah.
very obvious because we have to all remember, for those who don't understand, this is kind of the second hurrah of Napoleon. Everyone knows him now. Everyone knows like what to expect from him and how he deals with people. So he wasn't going to get away with anything this time around.
Yeah, but it's still. I do admit I wanted to say this on on a bigger stage. It's still amazing what that man accomplished in his life.
He's
You
the
know,
greatest conqueror.
it
Yeah.
it took a united Europe, all of them pouring immense amount of resources and men, all united, no disunity, to just take him and France down.
Yep.
That is what it took to bring him down, and that's amazingly impressive to me.
Because whenever, the oldest locker room conversations, the great conquerors in history, Alexander the Great, Caesar, you can put Genghis Khan in there. You can put Kublai too if you wanted to. And then Napoleon, it's hands down, and it has a lot to do with, the age they live in, because Napoleon's dealing with logistics that those commanders couldn't dream of. Like maybe Genghis Khan a little bit could understand, like the length of moving
Yeah.
supplies, but Napoleon was a genius in all theaters, like so in strategy and tactics, it's he
Well, I
knew.
mean, his logistics, kind of won't give it fully to Napoleon. I would give it to Marshal Berthier, his chief of staff,
Mm,
because that guy was excellent. But you did highlight the theme that separated all these great conquerors that you mentioned from the rest, logistics. They
Yeah.
all knew to plan their logistics. And that's pretty much the only thing that, these guys actually cared about when in campaign. Napoleon in Russia, in Germany in Russia 1812, Germany 1813. The only thing he's worrying about is getting ammo, getting food, getting weapons to his armies.
And it's total war.
And
Like for Napoleon, unlike the others, this was basically total war. Because you can't argue for any of the others. The others they're doing these amazing offensives and campaigns into foreign lands and stuff, but they haven't gotten like the entire population on board to feed this war machine. Whereas Napoleon is in a position where it's almost like that in France.
I think that's just been the case for France for like almost 20 years now, if you
Yeah.
date back to the Revolutionary Wars.
So crazy that time
And
period. Yeah.
yeah, but just let's not forget that the coalition did also have to, however, give in a lot of resources. Like, even though
But
it's, as you said, they're not a total war economies,
yeah, but they had more
but
time and they did it at their own pace. Especially if you look at,
yeah,
I guess, Russia. Historically, Russia's very like they've always had this large army, but slow to get everything going.
yeah, actually, that's the case. So I think it just ends the case that only the Polish were successful in invading Russia ever in the winter.
Yeah. I don't want to go down the rabbit hole but for people who are interested, the ramifications of what is the end of the Napoleonic Wars, it brings down all the other empires. If it really, it's this kind of like curse, especially on the Russians. This is where it really starts to get bad for the Russian Empire.
Are you kind of referring to the revolutions that we first see in 1848 that start taking up,
Yeah,
becoming,
all
and then,
you can look in all the other
yeah,
empires. It was here where the populations, like the common people in these countries, got so fed up with the conditions, especially the serfs in Russia, because Russia is like almost feudal, like the way
yeah,
that their
it
society
is.
works. Yeah.
Just speaking about that, when Friedrich Wilhelm declared for Prussia in the Sixth Coalition, he called it the War of Liberation, but
Mhm.
like he did not want to call it the Freedom War as some of the people from the the peasants were calling it,
Yeah.
just because he knew what it meant.
And
So
another thing that because it's hard for people who don't understand kind of the history of like ancient warfare to the point where Napoleon starts to rise to power, the idea of taking commoners and training and arming them en masse was so it was a terrifying idea for the country that would do it because you're basically arming the people who could just overthrow your government. So like Napoleon did something that pissed off every monarch because every monarchy was like it was like it's on terms with how there was like red scares against communism where everyone looked at Napoleon and they're like, "Oh my God, he's unleashed Pandora's box." Like every monarchy, all the peoples in these different nations could basically use this model and just ruin what was kind of this tradition for centuries in Europe. Yeah.
yeah, but I guess the Prussians were the only ones that kind of did away with that old system.
Yeah, they modernized the
Because
military to a new extent. Yeah.
yeah, it's because it actually does point to the fact of you saying Russia was quite feudal,
Mm.
because by the time of the Crimean War, for example, while you still had the nobility in Prussia really, taking the senior positions, they really could not even take it unless they did decently at officer school.
Yeah. And
And
yeah, I don't actually know the history of when this happens. I believe this is later in history, but the Prussians are the first ones where they innovate military administrations. So they separate their two classes where there's soldiers and the officers and all that, but then there's like another wing for the administrators and I guess you would call them like the logistics people and
that
stuff.
was actually, I think, done in the build up to the Sixth Coalition
Six
by
coalition.
General Scharnost and Gneisenau. That was
Yeah.
one of their many reforms that they took. And it's quite an interesting set because that laid the foundation for what I really admire in Moltke's Prussian army that we would see in the 1860s, 70s. which was an amazing force in its own right.
I know this is way too deep down the rabbit hole, but for those who are
Yeah.
interested, but the Japanese, when they get opened up to the world, they send their best diplomats all around the world to find the best of any field to just incorporate what they can. And initially, they're reading older books, and it's all Napoleonic War stuff. So they start paying for all these French advisors for their military and their navy to come over. And then they start to realize because of the Franco-Prussian War, oh no, the Prussians have much more. They've innovated their military in a better way. So the Japanese fully throw the French out and they go with the Prussians.
And
It's
they took the
yeah.
Royal Navy for as their naval mentors, and I would say you can't get a better combination than that.
Yeah, you know what's funny? They immediately went to the British, but they had it was ingenious on the Japanese part. They knew to go to the British for most of the officer training for their navy, but they wanted to find the enemy of the British to figure out how to defeat the British. So they hired a bunch of French naval commanders and they adopted what is the Jundaku strategy. And that's basically what really made the Imperial Japanese Navy what it was, World War One, World War Two, was the combination of how to be English and how to beat the English as the French. That's what they did.
That's actually pretty smart. I never knew that, but I think that's we've just completely gone a
Off
century
again.
ahead.
But I want to thank you because I thought this was going to be a 3 hour podcast and I didn't know what to do. But you summarized what is almost like World War One in an hour and 50 minutes about. And I just want to say to the audience before we close up, again, I have a brand new YouTube membership. I know I keep repeating this, but I do think it's worth your while. And even if you don't watch my YouTube channel stuff, all of the exclusive podcasts are uploaded there in a new format. And I mean, if you want to see our faces, we do videos of all these podcasts, by the way. Also, there's going to be a few episodes that you can't find anywhere else. They're unlisted for all other audience members, but if you're a YouTube member, you get access to them. Off the bat, there's like 6 episodes. They were a series I was calling the Speakeasy. They're just drunken debauchery. It's actually stuff I just couldn't put up. But if you're a member, you get to watch it. But if you join the YouTube membership or the Patreon, you get access to the exclusive podcast. You get access to all the content I make months in advance sometimes, and voting rights for the subjects I'll tackle next. So just had an episode on France's role during the Pacific War. The next episode is going to be the second thing everyone voted on last month, which is looking at how the century of humiliation formed the People's Republic of China. It's actually going to be me talking a lot about Xi Jinping right now and things that he says to the populace, because he brings up the century of humiliation a lot and the history behind it. So it's an interesting, like, looking in the future, looking at the past kind of podcast. And I just want to say also, the audience is probably recognizing we're not just talking about the Pacific War anymore. We're trying to tackle new subjects. We did, Gerov's top 10 Roman generals of the Republic. We just did Leipzig. And I'm trying to push this more towards a general history podcast because I already do an entire thing for the Pacific War for kings and generals. So if you want to hear more about this, you really got to come over to YouTube and put the comments on some of my videos, or you can email me. Just check out my YouTube channel. The email address is over there. Or you can join my Discord. Again, go to my YouTube channel. You can find a link to go over to my Discord because for podcasts, there's not really a way to comment. Unfortunately, they don't have really a means of doing so. And I hope you guys find this interesting. And if you have subjects you want us to tackle, just send me messages and we'll try and do it between the two of us where our interests lie. Yeah.
Well, Craig, just once again, thanks for having me on here. Really enjoyed speaking about this battle. So hope to
Oh,
continue doing a lot more, not only Pacific War, but anything.
yeah.
It's a great learning experience. I always admire that.
And I guess I'll let the audience in on a few things. I have been working on about 6 different series for Kings and Generals that aren't even out for the public yet. I think maybe the Russo-Japanese War series is starting to come out for the public, but they're all kind of behind a paywall for more than half a year at this point. But I have a ton of notes and materials from all these series I did, and we're going to be doing some podcasts on them. So look forward to stuff like the Sicilian campaign, the Italy campaign during World War II, and much more. It'll come soon.